America believed in law and order, but in a country thousands of miles south, that belief was about to become a deadly illusion. The year was 1960, and in Colombia, the government wasn't just weak, it was disappearing. What followed would eventually reach into American cities, American lives, and reshape the modern war on drugs forever. Within 30 years, this collapse would flood American streets with cocaine, kill thousands, and force the United States into a war it could never truly win. But to understand how one man could later hold two nations hostage, you have to understand what Colombia had become, a place where violence was currency, where the state existed only in name, and where the next generation would learn that power came from the barrel of a gun. This is the story of how a country prepared the ground for a monster, and how America, watching from afar, had no idea what was coming. In 1960, Colombia was a democracy on paper. In reality, it was a laboratory for chaos. The civil war known as La Violencia had officially ended 2 years earlier, but its legacy lived on in every village, every neighborhood, every conversation conducted in whispers. The statistics were staggering. Over 200,000 people had died in a decade of political violence that made headlines in American newspapers, then disappeared from memory as other crises demanded attention. But the dead don't disappear so easily in a place where justice was a luxury few could afford. The government in Bogotá controlled the capital and little else. In the countryside, in the mountains, in the sprawling barrios that surrounded cities like Medellín, authority belonged to whoever had the most guns and the will to use them. The state had retreated into an idea, leaving reality to those bold enough to seize it. But this wasn't chaos. This was training. Behind the diplomatic cables flowing between Washington and Bogotá, American officials were beginning to realize they were watching something unprecedented. The slow-motion collapse of a nation that was supposed to be an ally. What they didn't understand yet was that this collapse was creating opportunities. And in Colombia in 1960, opportunities were seized by those who understood that violence wasn't just a tool, it was the only reliable currency in a country where everything else had failed. The conservative and liberal parties continued their ancient dance of hatred, each blaming the other for the blood that had soaked Colombian soil. But beneath the surface of this tired political theater, something new was stirring, a generation that had grown up with violence as a constant companion, that had learned to navigate a world where the law was whatever the man with the gun said it was, and someone was learning very fast. Poverty in Colombia wasn't just an economic condition, it was a weapon. In the slums surrounding Medellín, unemployment wasn't measured in percentages, it was measured in desperation. Children as young as 10 learned that survival meant taking what you needed, and that authority was something you created, not something you obeyed. The legitimate economy was strangled by corruption, inefficiency, and the simple fact that legitimate business required a functioning state to protect it. Without that protection, without courts that worked or police who couldn't be bought, the economy belonged to those who could enforce their own rules. Smuggling was nothing new in Colombia. The geography that made the country beautiful, mountains that touched the clouds, jungles that swallowed armies, coastlines that stretched for thousands of miles, also made it perfect for moving things that weren't supposed to be moved. Emeralds, gold, coffee that somehow avoided taxes. It was a tradition as old as the Spanish conquest. A former U.S. State Department official later revealed something that never made the reports from that era. American intelligence agencies were already tracking unusual patterns of organized crime in Colombia, but they couldn't agree on whether it was a threat to American interests or simply another symptom of Latin American instability. What they were seeing was the birth of something unprecedented, criminal organizations that operated with the efficiency of corporations and the ruthlessness of armies. These weren't street gangs fighting over territory in a single neighborhood. These were networks that understood borders were lines on maps, not barriers to business. The contraband economy was teaching a generation of Colombians lessons that would reshape two continents. They learned that governments were customers, not masters. They learned that violence was an investment, not a cost. And they learned that Americans would pay extraordinary prices for things they couldn't get legally. Medellín in 1960 was a city in transformation, though no one could have predicted what it was transforming into. Nestled in a valley surrounded by mountains, it had been known for its textile industry, its flowers, its proud Antiochian culture of hard work and family values. But beneath that respectable facade, something darker was taking root. The city was a magnet for refugees from the rural violence, people who had fled their homes with nothing but their lives and whatever skills they had learned in a decade of chaos. Some of those skills involved moving goods without attracting attention. Others involved persuading people to see things differently. And some involved making problems disappear permanently. The barrios that sprawled up the mountainsides around Medellín were laboratories of survival. Children learned mathematics by calculating smuggling routes. They learned geography by memorizing the locations of police checkpoints. They learned economics by understanding that risk and reward weren't abstract concepts. They were the difference between eating and starving. One child was paying closer attention than the rest. At this point in Colombian history, crime wasn't organized in the way Americans understood it. It wasn't controlled by families or syndicates with clear hierarchies. It was fluid, opportunistic, constantly shifting, but it was learning. And what it was learning would eventually challenge everything the United States thought it knew about fighting organized crime. The smuggling networks that operated out of Medellín were developing innovations that would later become standard practice in international drug trafficking. They were learning to compartmentalize information so that arrest of one cell wouldn't compromise the entire operation. They were learning to corrupt systematically, identifying which officials could be bought and which had to be eliminated. Most importantly, they were learning to think big. The traditional Colombian criminals had been content with local markets, local corruption, local power. But the new generation was studying maps of the world, understanding that their real customers weren't in Colombia at all. In 1960, most Americans had never heard of Colombia. Those who had knew it as a producer of coffee, emeralds, and occasional political instability that made brief appearances in newspaper headlines before disappearing back into the general category of Latin American problems. But American demand was already shaping Colombian supply in ways that neither country understood. The appetite for marijuana in American cities was creating opportunities for Colombian farmers who had learned that coca leaves and marijuana plants grew better in certain climates than coffee or corn. The economics were simple and devastating. A farmer could make more money from a small plot of marijuana than from acres of legitimate crops. The risk was manageable because law enforcement was inconsistent and often negotiable. And the market seemed infinite. American cities full of customers who could afford to pay premium prices for products that cost almost nothing to produce. One classified U.S. Embassy report from 1961 would later surface during congressional hearings, revealing that American diplomats were already concerned about the unusual entrepreneurial energy being directed toward illegal enterprises in Colombia's major cities. The report noted something that would prove prophetic. Colombian criminal organizations were displaying corporate-level planning and execution in their operations. They weren't just responding to opportunities, they were creating them. They weren't just moving products, they were building brands. American law enforcement in 1960 was organized around the assumption that crime was local. Police departments fought crime in their jurisdictions. Federal agencies focused on crimes that crossed state lines. The idea that criminal organizations could operate across national boundaries, coordinating activities from South America to North America, was largely theoretical. Colombian criminals were learning to exploit this American blind spot. They understood that bureaucracy was a weapon they could turn against their enemies. Every jurisdiction meant another potential break in the chain of investigation. Every border meant another opportunity to disappear. Children born in Colombia in the late 1940s had known nothing but chaos. They had come of age during La Violencia, had learned to read the signs that preceded massacres, had understood before they were 10 years old that survival meant never trusting anyone completely. These children, now teenagers in 1960, had been shaped by experiences that would have broken previous generations. They had watched their parents flee in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. They had seen neighbors disappear and learned not to ask questions about where they had gone. Violence for this generation wasn't abnormal. It was a tool like a hammer or a knife. It was something you used to solve problems when other methods failed. And in Colombia in 1960, other methods failed frequently. What the Colombian government didn't anticipate was that this generation would eventually turn the lessons of La Violencia against the state itself. They had learned not just how to survive violence, but how to organize it, systematize it, make it profitable. In the barrios around Medellín, teenagers were forming groups that would later be called gangs, but function more like primitive corporations. They had territories, hierarchies, codes of conduct. They provided services that the state couldn't or wouldn't provide: protection, justice, opportunity. The most successful of these groups understood that violence alone wasn't enough. They learned to combine it with intelligence, planning, and an understanding of human psychology that would have impressed academic researchers. They learned to build loyalty through fear, but also through genuine care for their communities. Among this generation of survivors, adapters, and innovators, some would become footnotes in history, others would become legends, and one in particular would become something the world had never seen before: a criminal who operated like a head of state, who commanded loyalty like a religious leader, and who understood that true power came from making yourself indispensable to the people you claimed to serve. Stay with us to discover how one boy would master these lessons better than anyone. By 1962, all the pieces were in place. Colombia had created the perfect conditions for the rise of organized crime that would eventually dwarf anything the world had previously seen. The state was weak, but not completely absent, strong enough to provide legitimacy to those who could capture it, but too weak to resist capture. The geography was perfect: mountains that provided natural fortresses, jungles that swallowed pursuit, coastlines that offered countless routes to international waters. The economy was perfect: legitimate opportunities, scarce enough to make illegal ones attractive, but legal infrastructure sophisticated enough to launder illegal profits. The social conditions were perfect: a generation that had learned to navigate chaos, that had been educated in violence, that had no sentimental attachment to the rule of law because the rule of law had never protected them. The moment Colombia's transformation became irreversible wasn't marked by any particular event. It was measured in small decisions, individual choices, adaptations that seemed reasonable at the time but collectively created something monstrous. A police officer accepting his first bribe because his salary wasn't enough to feed his family. A judge issuing a particular verdict because the alternative was a bullet. A politician making an accommodation with local strongmen because governing required their cooperation. Each of these decisions was rational, defensible, human. Together they created a system where crime wasn't just tolerated, it was integrated into the basic functioning of society, where the line between legal and illegal became a matter of perspective rather than principle. International observers watching Colombia in the early 1960s saw a country that was stabilizing after a period of civil conflict. What they were actually witnessing was a country learning to function with organized crime as a permanent feature of its political and economic landscape. History would remember many criminals, but only one would turn chaos into an empire. In December 1949, in the small town of Rio Negro, outside Medellín, a child had been born into this world of collapsing institutions and unlimited possibilities. His parents named him Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. They had no way of knowing that they had just brought into the world someone who would eventually embody everything their broken country had taught its children about power, violence, and survival. By 1960, Pablo Escobar was 11 years old, attending school in Medellín, watching the world around him with the alert intelligence of a child who understood that appearances and reality were different things. He was learning the same lessons as thousands of other children in similar circumstances. But he was learning them better. He was learning that authority was negotiable, that loyalty was valuable, and that fear was a resource you could accumulate like money. He was learning that the difference between hero and criminal often came down to perspective, and that perspective could be shaped by the right combination of generosity and violence. Years later, those who knew Pablo Escobar as a child would remember his unusual ability to understand what adults needed before they knew they needed it themselves. It was a skill that would eventually make him one of the most powerful men in the hemisphere. But in 1960, he was just another boy in a city full of boys learning that the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. The difference was that Pablo Escobar was paying closer attention than most to exactly how seizure worked. He was studying the mathematics of loyalty, how much generosity purchased, how much devotion, how much fear guaranteed, how much obedience. He was observing the economics of violence, when it was profitable, when it was wasteful, when it was necessary. Most importantly, he was developing an understanding that would eventually make him unique among criminals. The recognition that true power came not from being feared, but from being indispensable, from becoming so essential to so many people that your removal would cause more problems than your presence. Colombia in the early 1960s was unconsciously building the infrastructure that would eventually support the most powerful drug trafficking organization in history. Every corrupt transaction created a precedent. Every successful act of violence established a standard. Every accommodation between criminals and authorities carved out a space that would eventually be filled by someone who understood how to exploit it systematically. The networks of corruption, the techniques of intimidation, the methods of money laundering, the systems of political influence, all of these were being developed and refined in countless small operations throughout Colombia. What was missing was someone who could see how all the pieces fit together, who could envision the whole machine rather than just individual parts. The international drug trade already existed, but it was fragmented, inefficient, constantly disrupted by conflicts between different groups. What it needed was organization, vision, and someone willing to use violence not just as a tool of intimidation, but as a foundation for a new kind of political economy. This single decade of Colombian history would redefine the global war on drugs forever. The lessons learned in the barrios of Medellín, the networks developed in the mountains of Antioquia, the methods pioneered in the shadow economy of a failing state, all of these would eventually challenge everything the United States thought it knew about fighting organized crime. But in 1960, none of this was inevitable. Colombia could have chosen different paths, made different accommodations, developed different institutions. The tragedy of what followed wasn't that it was predetermined, but that it was preventable. The boy growing up in Medellín, who would eventually become Pablo Escobar, was shaped by his environment, but he also shaped it in return. The Colombia that created him gave him the tools and opportunities that would eventually make him the most wanted man in the world. But it was his genius and his evil that would turn those tools into weapons capable of challenging nations. Understanding Colombia in 1960 is essential to understanding everything that followed. The drug wars that would consume two countries, the thousands who would die, the billions that would be spent, the institutions that would be corrupted, all of it traces back to this moment when a society chose to accommodate criminal power rather than confront it. The United States, watching from afar, would eventually be forced to confront the consequences of Colombian choices made in this era. American policymakers who had paid little attention to South American stability would discover that instability had a way of traveling north, carried by organizations that understood geography differently than governments did. But perhaps most tragically, the Colombia of 1960 created the conditions that would eventually produce not just Pablo Escobar, but the idea of Pablo Escobar, the notion that criminal power could become so extensive, so systematic, and so integrated into society that it became indistinguishable from legitimate authority. This was the inheritance that a generation of Colombian children would receive. a country where everything was possible and nothing was forbidden, where the only limitations were imagination and courage, where the difference between criminal and hero often came down to who was telling the story. One of those children would eventually take these lessons further than anyone had imagined possible. He would build an empire that spanned continents, commanded armies, and challenged nations. He would become so powerful that governments would negotiate with him as an equal, so wealthy that he would literally burn money to keep warm, so feared that entire cities would empty at the mention of his name. But all of that begins here, in the Colombia of 1960, where the institutions that should have protected society were learning to profit from its destruction instead, where the rule of law became a suggestion rather than a principle, where violence became a currency more reliable than the peso. This is how monsters are made, not in a single moment of evil, but in 1,000 small accommodations with corruption, not through the failure of individuals, but through the systematic failure of institutions. Not because evil is inevitable, but because good is difficult, and difficulty is something that failing states learn to avoid. Colombia in 1960 created Pablo Escobar, but Pablo Escobar would eventually recreate Colombia in his own image, building a country within a country where his word was law, his money was justice, and his violence was the only authority that mattered. The story of how that transformation happened begins here, in a broken state that taught its children that power was the only thing that couldn't be taken away. And in the next episode of this documentary series, we will meet that child as he takes his first steps toward becoming the most powerful criminal in history. Make sure to subscribe, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about power, crime, and survival.